So we're starting a brand new series called Moving On. All right, so how many of you guys, you've ever been in a situation where you were forced to move on from one situation to another situation and you didn't like it? You didn't like the change. You were being forced to move on and you're like, I don't like this. When I was in 6th grade, so where are my 6th graders at? Okay. So when I was your age in 6th grade, see, there's no such thing as intermediate school when I was growing up where I'm from. There was just elementary, which went through 5th grade, and then middle school, which was 6th through 8th grade, okay? So when I entered into 6th grade, I had to make a decision. I like all the electives. I like art, band, choir, PE, all the stuff, okay? When I was in 6th grade, I then had to choose which electives I wanted to take. And I love art class, but not as much as band. So I chose band, and I had to move away from art class, which was really hard. In fact, I took 1 quarter of 6th grade. It was my 3rd quarter. It was like January through March. In 6th grade, I was like, I'm going to do art again just for a quarter. And then I went back for band. And I really missed art, but I had to move on. I had to choose. I got to that point in my life, I had to choose which one I wanted to do. It wasn't like elementary where you get to do them all. And so that was a bummer for me because I like doing that. Sometimes we're forced to move on when we don't want to move on. And it's difficult to do that. How do we move on when we don't know how? And chances are you've experienced this as well. But the big thing about moving on, the big aspect of moving on that we're going to talk about is how do you move on with your life? How do you move on with people when people wrong you? You guys ever been there? Somebody wrongs you and it leaves you sad, angry, frustrated, hurt, confused, and you have to move on somehow. Despite a betrayal, despite how somebody was treating you, despite whatever it was, you have to move on and you have to learn the F word. Forgiveness. Come on. This is church, guys.
I have a 21-year-old brother. Expect me to know.
Okay. So you have to learn forgive. I meant the Christian F word, which means forgiveness, because come on. Okay. So forgiveness, if I were to define it, is this. It's letting go of negative feelings that we have towards someone who has hurt, harmed, or disappointed us. So, do you guys catch that? Here's what you don't read, okay? This is what we often think forgiveness is, okay? We think forgiveness, and somebody said this first hour, because we were talking about this idea. And when I asked this question, what is forgiveness? Most of us think forgiveness is relieving the person who has hurt or harmed us, right? It feels like we're okay, you're guilty for wronging me, and I forgive you, so therefore you're released from guilt, right? That's what we feel like forgiveness is, but that's not what it is. Forgiveness has nothing to do with the person who hurt you. It has everything to do with the condition of your own heart. It's letting go of the negative feelings that we have, not of what somebody else did, but of the negative feelings we have towards someone who's hurt, harmed, or disappointed us. So maybe you're there. Maybe you're dealing with a fight with a friend, and you're going to have to learn how to move on from that. Or maybe someone is saying something really hurtful about you behind your back. Maybe a rumor was spread about you. Maybe you're going through a breakup. Guys, I remember being in 8th grade with my first girlfriend, and we broke up, and man, oh, it stings a little bit to this day because rejection is hard, guys.
No, not really.
You're like, not really. I don't have a heart, so rejection doesn't hurt me. Right? So, all right. Sugared up. It's Halloween. Here we go. So, maybe you've had somebody hurt you, or maybe you're having some feelings towards somebody, and you've got to learn how to move on from that. You got to learn to take some next steps and move on with your life so that you're not held back by those feelings. Maybe when you're in that position, you respond a number of ways. Maybe you don't know what to do next. You have no idea how to move forward. Maybe some of us spitball at what we should do. Some of us pretend that we're okay, even though we're definitely not. How many of you guys are there? You're like, oh no, I'm fine, I'm good. And then it starts piling up, and then suddenly something happens and you explode. And you're like, okay, I'm not okay. So some of you, we just, let's be honest, we pretend that we're okay even though we're not. Other of us, we try to get back at the person who wronged us. How many of you, that's you? You're like, oh, I'm going to make them feel the pain that they made me feel, right? Some payback, right?
Don't
Right? Some of you, maybe you say things that you shouldn't say. You let your temper get the best of you, and you just wail into them. You say what you probably shouldn't say. Others of us, maybe we try to ignore what we feel by distracting ourselves with hours of Netflix or TikTok or Disney Plus, because that's better than Netflix, or whatever it is. We distract ourselves. We cut ourselves off from the world, from our relationships. We put in those AirPods. We just kind of ignore everybody else, and we just try not to think about it. Many of us deal with this in a number of different ways, but what if I told you there's another option? And this is what we're going to be discussing throughout this whole series. What if there really was a way for you to forgive and move on? What if there was a way for you to forgive and not forget? You know the phrase, forgive and forget? That's a dumb phrase. You shouldn't listen to that. If you haven't heard that phrase, it's a thing, I promise. So people say, like, you should just forgive and forget, right? Well, that's impractical because you can't just forget, right? But you can move on. You can forgive and move forward. And so we're going to talk about how to do that. And in order to do that, we're going to look at the life of Paul. So Paul is responsible for writing most of the New Testament, and believe it or not, he actually was wronged quite a bit. There's one passage where he talks about, I was flogged, I was beaten, I was neglected, I was shipwrecked, and he talks about all the things that people did to him. He was like, I've been stoned, which means people throw you in a pit and throw stones at you until you die. But he didn't die, which was pretty cool. So it's dope. Yeah. So he's been wronged by a lot of people, and actually he was in a town called Thessalonica, and so we're going to read one of the letters that Paul wrote to the church in Thessalonica. And in this town, he had been rejected, he had been chased off, he was slandered, he was called a liar. Rumors were spread about him, they treated him terribly. And check this out, this is what Paul writes to them in this letter. He writes to the church in Thessalonica, who was very aware of how Paul was treated when he was in Thessalonica. And he writes this in chapter 5, verse 15. He says, make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always strive to do what is good for each other and for everyone else. Make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong. Basically, it's not your job to make sure that justice is served. Don't pay back wrong for wrong. And that can be a really tough thing to do. But that means that we have to, forgive and move on. How do you do that? Well, I think we should describe what unforgiveness does to us. Who is somebody, I need a volunteer that has big feet.
Oh, I have small feet.
Who has big feet?
I have small feet.
Right there in the back. Come on up. What size shoes do you wear? 11 and a half? All right. Come on up on stage for me. You can come up on stage for me. So you got 11 and a half shoes? 10 and a half shoes? Okay. That's my size, 10 and a half. Look at that. So I got tiny feet, guys. It's okay. You have very tiny feet if you wear sixes. All right, so before I lose you again, check this out. Would you mind being able to help me illustrate this idea of unforgiveness? Sure? I'm not giving you a choice because you're up here now. Okay, so take those shoes off for me. I want you to try your best to fit into these shoes, which are size 4. You think you can fit into size 4 shoes? I want you to try your best to fit into those shoes for me. You can untie them a little more and get your feet in. Make sure you get all snug. Well, you got to untie the shoelaces. They're still tied. You got to untie them. Try to get your feet in there. Here, I'll help you with this one. Done. What? All right. There you go. You take all the time that you need. Try to get into those shoes there. That's as far as it'll go. Show everybody how much your heel is sticking out of that thing. Okay. Put in the other one as far as you can go. Okay.
I could probably fit it. Do some model moves. Do some model moves.
There you go. Yeah. So pretend this is a runway. Do some little walking. Get comfortable in those shoes for me.
That is impossible.
It's impossible to get comfortable in the shoes? How come?
They hurt.
Because they hurt? Why?
They're tight and they're small.
They're tight and they're small. Okay. So what happens, have you guys ever worn shoes that are too small for you?
Yes, actually.
What happens when you wear shoes that are too small for you?
I have to go to the wheelchair for a day.
Blisters? Anybody get blisters from wearing shoes that don't fit right? So your feet will probably get sore, and you'll get foot cramps because your feet are all crunched up in there. You'll get sores maybe. It's a great experience, guys. So it's super fun, yeah. So when you wear shoes that don't fit you right, then it's painful. So you can go ahead and take those off. So give them a round of applause, guys. Yeah, and you can take those shoes back to Jonathan back there, who was kind enough to lend us those shoes. Don't throw them at them. Just go hand them to him. All right. No. Go take his shoes back. All right. So, let's zone in here for a bit. Here's what I want you to know. This is what's so important about forgiveness, okay? We think that by forgiving somebody else, that we're letting them win. How many of you can relate to that? When you forgive somebody, it feels like you're letting them win. Okay? It feels like you're the one losing when you forgive somebody else. But the reality is very different because, like I said, forgiveness has nothing to do with the other person or what they did to you. Forgiveness has everything to do with the condition of your own heart. And here's what happens. There's a kid I knew growing up. His name was Levi. No one in here is named Levi, is there? Okay. So when I was in elementary school, this kid in my class named Levi, he was the worst. I'm a Christian, and so I'm not supposed to hate people, but I hated Levi, right? He was one of those guys that went out of his way to make you feel terrible. He would draw you in and act like he cared about you, and he'd ask you questions about something. He's like, how do you feel about that? Like, and then he'd like be nodding with you in agreement as you share how you feel about something. He goes, yeah, everybody who's stupid thinks that. And then he would walk off, and you're like, what a jerk. Right? Like, he would just go out of his way to make you feel terrible. He would do things to get you into trouble and pretend like he knew nothing about it. Like, he was the worst, okay? So much to the point that when Chelsea and I were trying to name our kids, she threw around, hey, how about Levi? I like Levi. I said, no, we're not going to name a kid Levi. I knew a Levi, right? So if you're named Levi, I'm sorry. But I have a prejudice against you just based on your name. So, but the reality is, here's the thing. When we think that forgiveness is about relieving the other person of their guilt, here's the reality. Most of the time, the other person doesn't feel bad. And if they do feel bad, they're like, oh, sorry. And then they move on, and they don't think about it anymore, most likely. Most of the time. So when you forgive somebody, it's not letting them go. It's not letting them off the hook. What it is it's changing the posture of your own heart. It's allowing yourself to move on, regardless of how they feel about it. Because just like wearing shoes that are too small for you, unforgiveness is not hurting the other person, it's hurting yourself. Because you should be outgrowing that and moving on. You should move forward. But when you hold on to bitterness and unforgiveness, when you hold a grudge, what it does is it gives you blisters, it gives you sores, it makes you uncomfortable, and that's what it's doing to your heart, because it's not affecting the other person, it's only affecting you. And so the only way to move forward in forgiveness when somebody else has wronged you is to let it go. When you don't forgive, it hurts you. And that's the big misconception. We think that when we are holding on to something, when we try not to forget it, when we try to remember every detail about what makes us mad, then we're the ones that we're hurting ourselves. We're holding ourselves back. So when you don't forgive, it hurts. And here's the reality. Forgiveness takes more than a minute. How many of you get the impression that when you forgive somebody, it should be like, okay, well, I'm better now. I forgave them. Well, it's a process. It takes time. Forgiveness doesn't happen in a moment. It takes time. So if you were to forgive other people and work towards forgiveness, then you would feel more free, you would feel the burden lifted, and you'd get shoes that actually fit you, right? You would be able to live much more comfortably in your own feelings, in your own emotional state, because you'd be okay with where you're at, regardless of if they're sorry, regardless of whatever it is. And sometimes there are things that, people do something to you that is truly wrong, and maybe that maybe forgiving them doesn't mean that you have to be friends with them now. Forgiving just means that you set healthier boundaries, you avoid when you can, and you just play nice, but you try to move on. Sometimes they don't want to let you move on because they want to torment you. But you have to be in a mindset where you're like, hurt people hurt people. Have you ever heard that phrase? People who are hurting hurt other people. Hurt people hurt people. And so if you can think about it from that perspective when somebody is tormenting you or when somebody is doing things that aren't nice to you, and you can just kind of hurt people, and you just move on, and you don't let it bother you, you actually have more power than the other person. But there's something that I want to make a distinction here, because there's a difference between that and if somebody is actually like abusing you or doing things that are wrong. Forgiving doesn't mean be silent. You can go talk to somebody. You can talk to a trusted adult about what's going on, and don't keep it to yourself. Okay? It's okay to speak up. Okay? It doesn't mean you're not being unforgiving. So I have to make that clarification. So first thing I want you to do is I want you to be honest about how you feel. Okay? Because if you want to move forward in forgiveness, you have to be honest. You can't just ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist. You can't just you have to be honest about how you feel. Otherwise, you will blow up later. Otherwise, you won't process those feelings and be able to move forward. So be honest about how you feel. It's okay to feel hurt. It's okay to feel upset. It's okay to be angry. I mean, if somebody else wronged you, you deserve to feel those things. It's okay. But you can't stay there. You got to be able to move forward. So be honest about how you feel so that you can process and move forward. Secondly, remember that everyone is worthy of forgiveness. Okay? Now, this is tough. But you know how you make mistakes sometimes? You know how you do things that you regret? You know how we have a God that forgives you despite your own mistakes? So if God can do that for you, who is perfect, and he can forgive your imperfections, then that means, you who are imperfect can forgive other people who are imperfect. So everybody is worthy of forgiveness, and that's because of the God that we have. Number 3, choose to move on. You can choose to keep wearing those shoes, keep being the martyr, keep being the person who's hurt, but it's only hurting yourself. So you can choose to take off those shoes. You can choose to talk to somebody. You can choose to move forward. You can choose to try to process those feelings. Choose to move on. And 4, this is a really important one. Repeat. Rinse and repeat. Because I promise you, somebody will hurt you again later. It might be the same person for the very same thing. But you have to repeat the process. Every time it happens, every time somebody wrongs you, you have to repeat the process of forgiveness. But here's the good news about that. The more you do it, the easier it is. The more you do it, the less it bothers you. The more you do it, the more emotionally secure you're going to be able to be. So when you don't forgive, remember that it just hurts you. When you don't forgive, it hurts you. So as you guys get ready to go to your small groups, think about this. What's one thing that you've had a hard time moving on from? What's one thing you've had a hard time moving on from? I want you to think about that question. You'll talk about it within your groups. Let me pray, and then you guys will go to your groups.